Hey, this is Jeff Ratcliffe here. Let's talk about the value in daily fantasy for a minute. The big prizes, yeah, they're attractive, but you have to finish in the top 2% out of thousands of experts to win any real money. So even on your best day, you still feel like you're losing. Now you can play something better. Stat Hero. Stat Hero is a house-based game that combines the best of daily fantasy and survivor pools. Each Stat Hero contest lasts multiple days, but requires only one entry fee, so your money lasts longer. Yes, you can play multiple days with only one entry fee. Stat Hero gives you smaller contests and more chances to win, and no more competing with sharks or experts ever, because your only competition is Stat Hero itself. Survive the game and download Stat Hero today and see how the face of daily fantasy has changed. Finally, a game designed for the rest of us. Stat Hero now open for NFL and NBA. For more information, please visit stathero.com.
What is up? It's the Pro Football Focus Fantasy Podcast. My name is Jeff Ratcliffe, and it's Friday, December 27th. Week 17 coming at us here. And I'm telling you, I love me some Week 17. Gives us an opportunity to play a little DFS. Sit back, relax, let the chaos ensue, especially in that 4 o'clock window. This is going to be really interesting. And what I did this week, a little bit different than the first 16 weeks of the season, because, hey, if you have your fantasy championship in Week 17, you know you're part of the minority, and hey, you do you. I'm not going to sit here and say you absolutely shouldn't. I wouldn't. I definitely would not do that, especially if I was a Lamar Jackson owner. I would not be too happy about having a Week 17 fantasy championship, but hey, again, you do you. Regardless, this show is really geared towards more of a DFS angle. And if you don't play DFS or you barely play DFS, this is a good week to just dip your toe in the water. I'm not saying go all in. Dip your toe in the water, play some of these showdown slates especially. I think that makes these games really interesting. And if you've never done it before, of course, our guy Kevin Cole at pff.com has you set up with the information you need to know. That San Francisco-Seattle game is a great one there for Sunday night. Great one to play some showdown. So anyway, I want to dive into each one of these games, just give you some quick upgrades, downgrades for each of the games this week for DFS purposes. We'll get things kicked off with the Jets and Buffalo Bills. This game is pretty interesting from a line movement standpoint. Open up at -4 for Buffalo. It's down to -1.5. Sneaky. 36.5 over under, so don't expect a lot of scoring. And I really don't like much from the New York side. Sam Darnold, pretty bad matchup, right? That Buffalo defense, no joke. Nice work, Sean McDermott. Le'Veon Bell, I mean, yeah, he had 30 touches last week with all that inefficiency against Pittsburgh. We've seen some running backs be able to run on Buffalo at various points this season, but generally speaking, just not the time to play Le'Veon Bell. On the other side, I look at Josh Allen, I see the price point, I say, you know what, he's reasonably priced. I do think I want some exposure to him in tournaments just because we know he has a high ceiling, he has a lot of upside, as the kids like to say. And if you're going to do that, then hey, stacking him with John Brown is pretty interesting. So Brown is going to see a lot of Arthur Maulet in this game. And maybe I don't pay enough attention to this or talk about this enough, but speed is obviously pretty darn important at cornerback. And there have been a lot of studies on this, especially when you're dealing with a speedy receiver like John Brown. Maulet's 40 time is 4.62. So not fast, right? I mean, fast for a normal human being, yes, but not NFL fast. He's going to have a tough time keeping up with Brown. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Brown get deep for one. Don't mind that stack at all this week. Also think, Devin Singletary is interesting, but the Jets do allow 3.2 yards per carry to opposing running backs, so may want to fade him. Cleveland and Cincinnati up next. This line has stayed pretty stable from open at -2.5 for Cleveland. You might see -3 on a couple books. Either way, Joe Mixon was a big-time fantasy disappointment last week because of the flu, and this is one of the reasons why it's always good to double-check the rankings over at pff.com before you set your lineups there at around 12:30 Eastern. is when they get finalized. And I ended up moving Joe Mixon down. I probably didn't have him low enough, but I moved him. I had him at 4 for a good chunk of the week last week. I moved him down to 12 in that last roughly hour before kickoff. But anyway, I think he bounces back. The Browns defense is the number 12 fantasy matchup for opposing running backs. And I like Tyler Boyd a lot this week after last week, of course. But TJ Carey is who he'll see a lot of out of the slot. He's allowing a 74% catch rate on the season. Baker Mayfield. Remember a couple weeks ago when these teams faced and everybody was like, Baker, baby. And it did not work out that week. But I'm going to do it again. Baker, baby. Cincinnati allowing 8.1 yards per passing attempt. We saw OBJ get in the end zone last week. I like Jarvis Landry in terms of his price point as well. This could be a decent end cap to the season here for Cleveland, just given the matchup. All right, moving on to Green Bay and Detroit. Green Bay heavy favorites, open at 10.5. It's up to 13 now for the Packers, 43.5 over under. Aaron Jones, 16 rushing touchdowns on the season. And the Lions defense allows 0.9 rushing scores per game, so almost a full rushing score per game to running backs. Yeah, sometimes it's really just that simple. Also like Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams here, Detroit allowing the second most net passing yards per game, 293.9 per game there. Kerryon Johnson, let's talk about this guy. So obviously he got back last week, 10 carries against Denver. Now, Johnson has the upside. We know that. We know he has home run hitting ability. But he's very risky. Like if you're a cash game player, he's very risky. That being said, I'm punting. I'm going to have a couple punts there with Kerryon Johnson because while Detroit, or Green Bay that is, did do well against Minnesota's run game last week, they have been vulnerable against the run. Now, it's not going to be the best game script, very likely here for Detroit. That's why he's only a punt. But he's one of those, you get him on the cheap, you can build around that and toss him into a couple lineups. Don't go overboard with Kerryon Johnson, but he's definitely a punt. Chargers, Chiefs, divisional games galore this week. Love divisional games. Anyway, the Chiefs are 9-point favorites, open at 7.5. It is currently a 45.5 over under. That's gone way down from 48 at open. Let's talk about Melvin Gordon. The matchup on paper, you look at the matchup, you say, wow, Kansas City stinks against running backs. True. But when you look at a game that isn't especially high scoring, at least, implied totals suggest 45.5, that's not super high scoring, and your team is 9-point dogs, that does not sound like a run-heavy game script, does it? You don't need advanced chops and analytics to figure that one out. So what this suggests to me is Austin Eckler actually is the play, not Melvin Gordon, because Kansas City still struggles against running backs, but the game script means we're going to very likely see more of Eckler than Gordon here, and they're both similarly priced. I think it's Eckler is more expensive on DK, less expensive on FanDuel, but very close between the two of them. So I'm going to play Eckler, and I'm going to fade Gordon in this one. On the other side, too, it's very tempting to fire up Damian Williams this week. Price point is pretty solid. Number 7 fantasy matchup for running backs. And he saw 19 touches, 92 scrimmage yards, and a score last week. It was kind of the production we had hoped to see for most of the season out of Damian Williams when you consider where he was drafted. Far from safe, but I like the price point. I like the upside. I like the game script. I'm going to use Damian Williams in this one. Chicago and Minnesota. This line, very curious movement. Open at 7.5. Minnesota giving 7.5. They're now at -1. So a 6.5 point line movement there. 37 over under. Don't expect a lot of scoring here. But Allen Robinson, I keep talking about him every week, and for good reason. He's a top 10 fantasy receiver right now. He's number 8. 11 catches shy of 100 for the season. And I mean, hey, he could do that. Now, it's 11 catches, a lot of catches, unless you're like Michael Thomas or Christian McCaffrey, but it's a lot of catches. But the Vikings defense, I mean, think about it. Xavier Rhodes, opposing wideouts have caught 84% of targets thrown into his coverage. I talk about that every week. And the last time they faced each other, Rhodes allowed 7 catches on 8 targets. That was back in week 4. So Allen Robinson, love him. Yeah, that Mike Boone thing didn't work out well last week. We know. Yes, we know. Alexander Mattison, will he be back on the field? He was limited. Dalvin Cook was limited as well. Don't expect Dalvin Cook to play. Either way, I don't want to mess with this backfield. Even if Madison gets back, it's not the greatest matchup. There are a lot of better options. We have so many options on the main slate this week. Just going to fade it all together. Really fade Minnesota as a whole. There's not much there that is appealing to me. Maybe a little bit of Stephon Diggs, just because of his big play upside, but otherwise fading Minnesota. Miami, New England. Currently New England 16-point favorites at open at -14. Julian Edelman, still banged up with the knee injury, but he did get limited work in at practice this week. And obviously, he comes with risk, but man, Miami allowing 1.8 receiving scores per game to opposing wideouts. Get a little Edelman, maybe get a little N'Keal Harry on the cheap, get a little Mo Sanu. Not much upside there, more of a DK than an FD play, but there you go. On the other side, Devontae Parker, love what he did this season. So happy to see him finally breaking out, but the problem is the schedule makers were not kind. He's a top 15 fantasy receiver. He's going to finish as a top 15 fantasy receiver, but he's got to face Stephon Gilmore. 46% catch rate this season, and yeah, that's going to be a shadow. That's almost a lock for a shadow. Atlanta and Tampa Bay. This one right now is Tampa Bay giving one, open at 2.5. Julio Jones, not cheap. We know that. Never cheap for Julio. But Tampa Bay is such a good matchup. Now, Jones didn't do much in Week 12 against Tampa Bay. They do some interesting stuff. Tampa Bay will occasionally shadow with Carlton Davis. Not that Carlton Davis is anything to be fearful of, but sometimes a shadow will cause the quarterback to look the other way. That other way was Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley's not playing this week, so I'm expecting a lot of Julio Jones in this one. Enormous fantasy ceiling. He's a premium DFS option, based on his price point, but I think he is worth paying up for, and I think you can work him into lineups given that you can find some deals this week. Jameis Winston, not a pretty season, right? But 92 passing yards to 5,000. No wide receivers, doesn't matter, right? 300 plus last week with the same group, and it's a very fantasy-friendly matchup. I don't think he throws for the 570 that he needs to get the all-time record there to go past Drew Brees and Peyton Manning because they're back-to-back. I don't think he cracks the top two. Let's put it that way. Could he be number 3 all-time? Yeah, he has a pretty darn good shot at that. So we shall see where he ends up. Anyway, I do like using him in DFS regardless of the situation with his wide receivers this week because Jameis, DGAF, he's just going to keep throwing a darn ball. New Orleans and Carolina. With this matchup here, we're looking at -13 for New Orleans. Open at -11.5. Got to figure they're big time favorites here. And there's a few factors. Obviously, Michael Thomas is amazing. He's going to be shadowed by James Bradbury, but he caught all 5 of his targets for 51 yards in a score against Bradbury in Week 12. So not worried about him. He's premium price. Alvin Kamara, though, isn't, right? He's slightly discounted. And Carolina, wow, their run defense is not good. Number 1 fantasy matchup for running backs. 1.7 rushing scores allowed per game to the position. Alvin Kamara pushing all the chips in. He's as chalky as chalk can be this week. And on the other side, hey, DJ Moore's still in the league concussion protocol. We'll see if he plays this week. If he does, not worth playing in DFS. Marshawn Lattimore will likely shadow him. Will Grier under center. That also doesn't help the cause. Christian McCaffrey. He is amazing. He is extremely expensive. I don't want to be overexposed to him just given that price point because it's hard to sneak him in lineups and then build a lineup that you really feel has enough depth and upside to do well in GPPs, right? And even cash games to do well in cash games, enough depth, right? So that's where we are with Christian McCaffrey. All right, moving on to Washington and Dallas. And this line has shifted. Open at -7 for Dallas. It's now -10.5. Here's the thing. Dak is banged up, so I'd be curious to just keep an eye on this line movement as we head into the weekend. But regardless, it's hard to like really anything on the Washington side. Even McLovin, he's in the concussion protocol, so he may not play. So really, what I'm looking at here is one of my chalkiest plays of the week, Ezekiel Elliott. Just follow the trends. we've seen the last 2 weeks. Miles Sanders goes off against Washington. Saquon Barkley goes off against Washington. Ezekiel Elliott, obviously pretty good in his own right. And then you say, okay, Dak Prescott is banged up. It's a favorable game script. I mean, all signs point towards Zeke going nuts in this contest. Oakland and Denver. And obviously, Oakland needs to win in this one, but they are not favored. The betting public has moved the line a little bit, though, from open. So Denver opening up as 5-point favorites. They're now 3.5-point favorites in this one. Now, the Josh Jacobs thing, he did have the surgery, but it had nothing to do with his shoulder. It was for a skin infection, so it's nothing significant there. No worries about that one. That being said, I mean, I can't see any way you're using Josh Jacobs. And even somebody like Hunter Renfrow, who had a nice game last week, I can't see using any of these guys. Obviously, Darren Waller's in play, but he's so expensive. I'm actually probably fading most all of Oakland in this contest. I'm not fading Denver, though, in particular, Courtland Sutton. I mean, hey, he's been awesome this season. And that all actually began back in week 1 when he faced the Raiders. 120 receiving yards in that contest. And of course, it's a very different team. Back then, they had Manny Sanders. Joe Flacco was under center. But I'm not really worried about that. It's just a beautiful matchup. Hey, Trayvon Mullen is in the concussion protocol. It's being called a neck injury as well. So we're going to see Keyshawn Nixon out there. UDFA out of South Carolina. He's allowed 5 catches on 6 targets for 105 yards in his 3 games played this season. That's over 20 yards per catch. Courtland Sutton, giddy up. Arizona and the Rams. You're not going to find a line on most books on this one because books are waiting to see what happens with the starters for the Rams. But I tell you, I don't see a situation where they end up resting Tyler Higbee. And obviously, you love the matchup against Arizona. Everybody knows that. You love the fact that he has 4 straight 100-yard performances. He's really been phenomenal. Hopefully, this continues to next year. I ranked him as such, by the way. But either way, love using him this week. Now, on the other side, we cannot ignore Kenyon Drake, right? And obviously, what he's done over the last 2 weeks is phenomenal. Kenyon Drake is awesome. Who would have thought that we would have said that? But he has been really tremendous for Arizona. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use some Kenyon Drake, and I'm also going to stack him with the Cardinals defense. And I know that sounds crazy given how bad the Cardinals defense has been for most of the season. But the strong possibility that we're going to see Blake Bortles under center means that, hey, Blake Bortles throws pick sixes. That's what he does. We play the Arizona defense. Not a play for the faint of heart, but I am going to make that play, stacking him with Kenyon Drake. Philadelphia and the Giants. Philly, 4.5-point favorites, open at 5.5 here, and Philly is banged up. No doubt about it. Do not expect to see Nelson Aguilar out there, and I think it's going to be really close for Zach Ertz, and I think he may not end up playing. He hasn't practiced yet this week. I don't have a Friday practice report in front of me. I'm recording this on Friday morning. If he gets to limited, though, that's a good sign. If he goes DMP, he is not playing. Either way, I expect a lot of Dallas Goedert this week. He had season-high 12 targets last week. I think we see another double-digit target workload for him again this week. Especially if Ertz does not play. On the other side, Darius Slayton, just a couple weeks ago, he was a monster against the Eagles. And the thing the Eagles do not do well is defend speedy wide receivers who can get downfield. They just don't have the corner play to do so, and they really don't have the free safety play to do so. So I like Slayton, having some exposure to him and some Danny Dimes this week as well. Indy and Jacksonville. In this one, and the open at Jacksonville -1, which I thought was an interesting opening line, but it's 3.5 now for Indy, which now makes a lot more sense. The return of the Mac. Marlon Mack bouncing back last week, and it's another nice matchup. Jacksonville, a number 2 fantasy matchup for running backs. 5.35 yards per carry to the position. Mack put up 109 yards and a score against the Jags back in week 11, so like him this week. Don't like anything on the Jacksonville side. It's just tough. I mean, Marone's going to be back next year, it looks like, but this is a downward spiral for the Jags. Going to fade them. Even though price looks nice for somebody like Gardner Minshew, not going to use him this week. Moving on to Pittsburgh and Baltimore, and the line has moved pretty significantly here. You're seeing Baltimore now 2-point dogs. They open at 3.5-point favorites. This is obviously due to the fact that they're going to be resting their starters, but I don't want to mess with this. I'd love to come on here and be like, Justice Hill. I can't do that. I mean, I think we will see some Justice Hill, but we're also going to see plenty of Gus. It's just such a mess. Even on the Pittsburgh side, I just don't trust these guys enough to have much exposure to them. So I'm going to just fade this game outright. Just not going to mess with anything in this contest. Tennessee and Houston. Right now, Tennessee 3.5-point favorites. Open as a pick'em, 45.5 over under. Ryan Tannehill, one of the bigger fantasy surprises of the season, no doubt about it. Since week 7, only Lamar Jackson with more fantasy points per game than Ryan Tannehill at the quarterback position. Amazing. And hey, Tennessee didn't win their last meeting, right? But Ryan Tannehill was pretty darn solid as a fantasy option. 279 yards, 2 passing scores, 10 rushing yards, but he had a rushing score. So he was rock solid. And a big part of that recent success, A.J. Brown, of course, 8 catches on 13 targets for 114 and a score in week 15 against the Texans. So yeah, we're going to fire him up with a stack with Tannehill this week, no doubt about it. I mean, we could stack Watson and Hopkins. Both are, well, Hopkins is sick and Watson is a little dinged up, but it does sound like they're going to play. It's just the price point on these guys. You know, I think you can get better stacks elsewhere. All right, so let's round it out with Sunday Night Football, San Francisco, Seattle. Seattle opened as favorites. They were 1-point favorites. Now it's 3.5 for San Francisco. This obviously only impacts us for the showdown slate. I mean, if you're playing the main slate, but you could play the whole day slate too. But really, I'm focused on the showdown for this one. So with the captain spot, I think you have to be looking at George Kittle. It's not cheap, right? And it's chalky. I get it. But the matchup is so darn good. Only the Cardinals give up more fantasy points per game than Seattle. So I'm going after this one with George Kittle because he could just put up a monster performance. On the other side, I mean, you know, Carson, Procise out, Marshawn Lynch, Bobby Turbin in, but it's actually Travis Homer. Look that one up anyway. Who's going to get the majority of the touches? He's a lightly used rookie. He's facing the 49ers. That really doesn't combine well for fantasy purposes, so I don't want to use Homer in my lineups there. Be interested to get a look at him, though. But anyway, there you go. There's the slate. This is Friday. We will be back on Monday. Next week, it's the NFL playoffs. And people are asking, when are you getting NFL playoffs content out? When the NFL playoffs start. So we will hit you up with that full week of podcast for you to get you all set up for the NFL playoffs. And hey, rookie stuff is coming soon as well on the pod. But enjoy the final week of the regular season. And, of course, feel free to hit me up on Twitter and Instagram at Jeff Ratcliffe. And PFF.com is the website. All right, catch you on the flip side of the weekend for another edition of the pod. For PFF, I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and I'm out of here.